George Strait, the king of country, is not only a legend of the genre, he is the unwavering heartbeat of American music, the force whose voice has shaped 5 decades of a nation's emotions. When Amarillo by morning, troubadour and check yes or no echo through small towns, dusty pickup trucks, military barracks, or humble kitchen radios across the country, they are not merely songs. They become a part of the nation's soul. From the harsh soil of a Texas ranch, from the painful fracture left behind when his mother walked away, George rose with a rare will and resilience, a strength that carried him to a place few ever reach. Yet the road that forged his monument was shadowed by darkness, loved ones taken one after another, cold cutting blows striking in the midst of glory. The kind of hits that could break even the strongest of spirits. And now at 73, just when millions believed he had finally found peace, his own battle with illness and Norma's, his partner of more than half a century, has stirred deep concern among those who love him. Before we begin, don't forget to leave a like in honor of George Strait, the man who turned every trial into immortal music and gave his entire heart to America. Every legend carries a moment that does more than break the world beneath their feet. It carves a wound so stark, so merciless that it shadows every step after. For George Strait, that shadow stretched long before fame ever found him. George Harvey Strait was born on May 18, 1952 in Poteet, Texas. But it was in Pearall, in the small wind-hit house and the raw, unforgiving ranch land near Big Wells, that his life took its true shape. His father, John Byron Strait Sr., traded the chalk dust of the classroom for the sting of rope burn and the weight of cattle gates, working both jobs with the same quiet determination that he later passed to his sons. George remembered the land as honest and harsh, a place where the sun burned without pity, and where a child learned early that the world owed no softness. Before he reached 10, the discipline of ranch life had already settled into him. The cold bite of dawn air, the creak of saddles, the silent understanding that a boy had to grow into his strength long before he understood it. The break, the brutal, life-defining one, came when he was 9 years old. What had been simmering tension in the house became overnight an irreversible rupture. George would one day recall a quiet that didn't feel like peace. It felt like something ending. And then it did. His mother packed a single bag, took Pensy by the hand, and stepped through the doorway. The hinges let out a long, tired groan as the door closed, a sound that, as George later admitted, never really stopped echoing. Buddy stood frozen beside him, jaw clenched, trying to be stronger than any child should have to be. It wasn't just a departure. It was the shattering disappearance of warmth. The voice that soothed him, the embrace that anchored him, ripped away in an instant too cruel to understand. George never spoke publicly about that day, not once. But those close to him said it changed the way he carried himself, hardening his silence, sharpening his discipline, shaping the quiet steadiness that defined him. From that moment on, it was 3 straight men, a father and 2 boys holding up a world that had collapsed without warning. When the door closed, ranch life didn't merely resume. It tightened around them like a vice. With no mother in the house and a father who refused to remarry out of duty and pride, the burden of survival pressed down with unrelenting force. George later said he learned early what loneliness really felt like, not from being alone, but from being surrounded by people who were hurting and refusing to show it. Mornings felt colder. Even the Texas sun couldn't warm the absence in that kitchen. George's hands blistered from mending fences, his shoulders etched from driving cattle across endless dusty acres. And dinners at the small wooden table were eaten in a silence that cut deeper than words. His father became their example. Stepping off the school bus in his teaching clothes, changing boots at the door, and walking straight into another full shift on the ranch. George learned not through conversation, but through witnessing. Strength wasn't noise. It was endurance. And through it all, Buddy was right there, the brother who shouldered half the weight without being asked. The one person who seemed to understand the ache beneath George's quiet. And still under all that exhaustion, all that silence, something fragile and luminous began to rise inside him. Music. A calling he couldn't name but couldn't ignore. By his teenage years, he slipped into a small garage band, the Stoics, chasing the electricity of rock and the wonder of the Beatles. He didn't listen to country radio. He said it felt too close to home, choosing instead the farmer's report, the familiar voice of rural life that made the house feel less empty. But destiny knows when to knock. One night in a Texas dance hall washed in neon glow, George heard country music not as entertainment, but as truth. The stomp of boots, the cry of the fiddle, the wounded steel guitar. It all felt like someone singing the very things he had carried in silence. In that moment, a quiet certainty rose inside him. He didn't yet know how far that certainty would take him. But the path had already begun, carved from heartbreak, shaped by labor, held together by a father's sacrifice and a brother's loyalty, and guided by a voice waiting for its moment to rise. It was one thing to survive the heartbreak of a fractured home, but stepping into adulthood with nothing but a quiet voice and a dream the world seemed intent on crushing was a brutality all its own. When George Strait returned from the Army in 1975 at 23, he carried discipline in his posture, but no certainty in his future. Texas did not welcome him with comfort. In 1976, he enrolled at Southwest Texas State University to study agriculture, choosing stability only because hope felt too risky. Money was painfully thin. Most weeks he lived off whatever he could stretch across days. Canned beans, rock-hard bread that scraped his gums, ramen packets rationed into 2 meals. His San Marcos apartment turned icy in winter. The walls seemed to exhale cold. Some nights he slept in his jacket, watching his breath drift upward like a reminder of how close survival and collapse truly were. Years later, he would admit, those years, they didn't just test me, they nearly broke me. And yet, inside that hunger and cold, one fragile ember refused to go out. Music. That ember pulled him toward a wrinkled flyer on a campus bulletin board, Stony Ridge looking for a singer. It was a long shot, but long shots were the only shots he'd ever known. He walked into a dim garage smelling of motor oil, dust, beer, and dying amplifiers. When he sang, it wasn't confidence that filled the room. It was honesty, bare and unvarnished, enough honesty for the band to take him in. They became ace in the hole, and from 1976 to 1979, they lived a grind that would have crushed most men. Honky-tons thick with cigarette smoke. Sticky floors, rowdy crowds who paid more attention to arguments than music, and endless Texas highways rattling beneath a van that sounded like it could fall apart any mile. Some nights they slept inside it, curled under thin jackets, using wadded shirts as pillows, because a motel room was a luxury far beyond reach. George would later confess there were nights I wasn't sure if anyone would ever really hear me. As harsh as the road was, Nashville proved far cruelty than cold nights in the van. From 1977 to 1980, George hauled demo tapes across the city, knocking on office doors that barely opened before slamming shut. Executives dismissed him without hesitation. He wasn't marketable. He was too traditional. He didn't have the right look. One man delivered the coldest cut of all. "Son, what you do belongs in the past." For someone still carrying wounds he never spoke of, every rejection felt like another blow to a dream already on life support. By late 1980, broke and worn down to the bone, George reached the edge. After a poorly paid gig one quiet night under fading neon lights humming their last breath, he unstrapped his guitar, set it gently on a folding chair, and whispered into the emptiness, "I'm done." He accepted a job designing cattle pens, not out of desire, but because surrender felt easier than hope. It was his darkest valley, the place where dreams froze before they died. But fate rarely arrives loudly. Sometimes it comes in the softness of someone who refuses to let you fall. His wife, Norma, saw the emptiness that failure carved into him. One evening, with a steadiness strong enough to pull a man back from the edge, she told him, "Give it one more year, George. Just one more." That simple sentence, quiet but unshakable, became the spark that dragged him out of the darkness. It carried him to Irv Woolsey, a former MCA executive who heard in George what Nashville had been too blind to hear. Woolsey believed with the kind of conviction desperate men clinging to. And because he believed, MCA finally cracked open one final door. They offered George a one-song test. One song, one chance, one last breath before the dream collapsed for good. The song was Unwound. What followed wasn't success. It was transformation. When Unwound released in 1981, George braced himself. When it began climbing the charts, he felt the air shift. And when it hit number 6, the world finally heard him. In that moment, the cold apartments, the nights in the van, the rejection, the hunger, the doubt, the years spent wondering if he mattered, all of it ignited into a blinding burst of triumph. That single song lit the fuse that would launch a defeated ranch boy toward a destiny carved in pure American stone. A destiny that would one day call him the king of country. When Unwound climbed to number 6 in 1981, it didn't merely lift a career. It blew open a wall George Strait had battered with numb knuckles for nearly a decade. That single breakthrough felt like a flare ripping through years of darkness. Cold, rented rooms where he slept with his coat pulled tight. Nights curled in the back of a dying van rattling over West Texas roads. Cheap meals shoveled down just to quiet the ache, and rejection sharp enough to bruise the soul. Suddenly, the boy from a fractured Texas ranch, the soldier, who had once stared at a stack of cattle pen diagrams, believing that was his fate, stood staring at a dream he'd been told belonged to other men. But when the door finally cracked open, the wind on the other side nearly knocked him down. Once foolhardy memory hit number 1 in 1982, the pressure cinched around him like iron wire. Nashville demanded hits without mercy. Radio demanded presence without sleep, and the crowds he loved demanded a perfection that could swallow a man whole. He crossed so many highways that sometimes he woke in hotel rooms unsure which state he was in. He sang through fevers, dizziness, and a throat rubbed raw. Years later, in one of his rare, vulnerable moments, he whispered, "Those years." I held on by grit more than anything else. The applause lifted him, but the silence afterward held a weight no spotlight could soften. As the late 80s bled into the 90s, George wasn't rising anymore. He was ruling. Platinum albums became routine. Stadiums burst at the seams before posters even made it onto walls. His 360 degrees stage design drew crowds so massive they moved like living oceans under the lights. Yet behind the curtain, the toll carved deeper and deeper. There were nights he stepped off stage with his hands shaking so hard he needed both palms to steady a cup of water. Mornings when his spine burned as if someone had drawn a hot wire through it. Afternoons when he pushed through rehearsal because canceling wasn't in his blood, even though he later admitted. There were days I didn't know if my body would hold. Meanwhile, Nashville drifted toward glossy pop edges, and critics dismissed him as too traditional, too clean, too anchored to the past. That pressure built like a gathering storm. And in 1999, it finally cracked open when he and Alan Jackson delivered Murder on Music Row. The industry shook. Supporters hailed him as the last keeper of country soul. Detractors sneered. He was refusing to evolve. George didn't answer either side, but his silence cut sharper than any interview. Still, the crowd swelled. His festival tours turned entire cities into oceans of denim and dust. And in 2014, when the Cowboy Rides Away thundered through AT&T Stadium, 104,093 fans rose as one, the largest indoor concert in American history at the time. But behind the magic, something inside him faltered. Backstage that night, he sat hunched on a folding chair, elbows on his knees, drawing breaths shallow and shaky the way a man does when he's holding himself together by threads. His lower back pulsed with heat. His fingers tingled. He later confided off camera, "My body started talking to me around then. I just didn't want to listen." Yet he walked back into the lights anyway because stopping felt like betrayal. A decade later in 2024, the impossible happened again. 110,955 voices erupted through Kyle Field as a 72-year-old George stepped onto the stage bathed in gold. What the crowd didn't see was the silent ritual backstage, the slow stretch of a stiff spine, the deep breath against a tightening rib cage, the quiet prayer that his body would hold for just 2 more hours. But when the music started, he stood taller than the pain. Then came 2025, the moment that stripped away the legend and revealed the unbreakable man underneath. In Phoenix, under desert lights mid-ong, a bolt of pain tore through his back so violently his hand clamped the microphone stand to keep from collapsing. For an instant, the world seemed to tilt, the band glancing over, waiting for him to stop. But George Strait, 73, worn, tested, hurting, straightened, steadied, and kept singing. 70,000 voices rose in a roar that felt like the earth itself lifting him up. It wasn't the size of the crowd that made the moment immortal. It was watching a man refuse to bow to pain, drawing on the same raw grit that carried him from ranch dirt to neon stages, from obscurity to the summit of American music. Through triumph and exhaustion, controversy and quiet suffering, one truth towered above all. George Strait didn't inherit a crown. He built it note by note, night by night, scar by scar, until even the mountain itself had no choice but to rise beneath him. The higher a man rises, the more fiercely the world searches for the shadows trailing behind him. And for George Strait, a man shaped by discipline, humility, and a quietness almost sacred, even the faintest whispers could swell into something far louder than truth. One of the earliest came from critics who questioned why he didn't write most of his own songs. They argued that a storyteller should carry the pen as faithfully as the microphone. But those who truly understood him, the listeners who felt rather than judged, compared him to Sinatra, a titan who proved that the power of a song doesn't lie in authorship, but in the soul that delivers it. Fans often said, "He doesn't just sing a song, he inhabits it." And George, in the way only he could, offered no debate. He would tell close friends almost shyly, "A song finds the man, not the other way around." It was his way of honoring the mystery of music, not with speeches, but with sincerity. As the years unfolded, the spotlight followed him into corners he never asked to enter. Environmental groups raised concerns about the carbon footprint of his private jet, estimating more than 400 tons of CO2 each year. The conversation swelled across message boards and comment threads, disappointment from some, confusion from others who couldn't reconcile the man who loved the land with the impact of his travel. Through it all, George answered the way he learned as a boy on the ranch, with silence that wasn't stubborn but contemplative. Those close to him say he'd sit quietly, elbows on knees, listening more to the criticism than most people realized. "I'm no saint," he once murmured to a longtime bandmate. "I'm just trying to live honest." He believed character wasn't proven by arguing back, but by how a man carried himself when the noise rose around him. And then came 2025. Not a ripple, not a whisper, but a jolt that cut straight through the heart of Texas. When George announced a major tour that, because of scheduling constraints, did not include a single stop in his home state, the reaction erupted instantly. It wasn't irritation. It was heartbreak sharpened into something visceral. Fans felt blindsided, as if a door they thought would never close had suddenly slammed shut. Some said it felt like being left behind. Others said it felt like the man who once carried their stories in his voice had somehow stepped beyond their reach. "Why not us?" they demanded. "Why not home?" The tension tightened like a pulled wire, fueled by a loyalty so deep it could wound when stretched too far. And behind that uproar, George felt the blow himself. Those close to him remember a night when he sat alone in a dim dressing room, hat turning slowly in his hands, murmuring, "I never meant to let home down." But he also knew with the heaviness only time can teach that even legends cannot stand on every stage where their names are called. So he met the moment the only way he knew how. With silence, steadiness, and the weight of disappointment carried without complaint, trusting that time, not explanations, would heal what distance had strained. In the end, these controversies, sharp, loud, and uninvited, did nothing to dim George Strait's legacy. If anything, they exposed its deepest truth. They showed that greatness does not shield a man from judgment. It simply reveals how he stands when the judgment comes. And for the fans who looked past the noise, a harder, clearer lesson emerged. A man is not extraordinary because he avoids every misstep. He becomes extraordinary because he meets criticism without bitterness, pressure without collapse, and expectation without pretense. George Strait never claimed perfection. What he offered unwaveringly was sincerity. And in a world consumed by outrage and clamor, sometimes the legacy that endures is not built by the loudest voice, but by the man who holds his ground with quiet integrity, decade after decade. Some storms a man can muscle through alone, but others strike so brutally, so relentlessly that only the right hand beside him keeps him from collapsing. For George Strait, that hand has always been Norma Voss, the only woman he ever loved, the one constant in a life that would one day roar louder than he ever imagined. Long before crowds chanted his name, long before the world crowned him king of country, they were simply two shy Texas teenagers sharing milkshakes they could barely afford, riding in old pickup trucks with the evening wind tangling their hair, whispering dreams so small and tender you could hold them in your palm. In 1971, at barely 19, they crossed into Mexico and got married with nothing but trembling hope and a promise spoken like a vow against the world. They had no idea how fiercely life would test the strength of those trembling hands. The tests did not wait. When George enlisted and was assigned to Hawaii, Norma gathered their entire world into 2 suitcases and followed him with a courage she didn't yet know she had. They lived in small, overheated apartments where groceries were counted down to the dollar, where dinner sometimes meant stretching leftovers to feed tomorrow. They laughed quietly in dim kitchens, argued softly in narrow hallways, and fell asleep under thin blankets, listening to ceiling fans rattle like old bones. Years later, George would look back on that chapter and murmur if she hadn't come with me. I don't know who I would have become. And when their daughter Jennifer arrived in 1972, joy filled the apartment like sunlight. Tiny socks drying over chair backs, lullabies sung off-key, mornings where the 3 of them felt like the world's smallest but happiest kingdom. But when George returned from the army and chased music with everything inside him, Norma stepped into a different kind of storm. The silent, grinding ache of being married to a man whose dream demanded far more than any dream should. Some nights she sat at the kitchen table long after dinner had gone cold, listening to the steady tick of the wall clock while George played in smoke thick bars hours away. She folded laundry in silence, paid bills stretched too thin, picked up toys on floors he barely walked across anymore. The road swallowed him, the quiet swallowed her, and still she stayed. Years later, George whispered a truth that lived like a bruise in his memory. I wasn't home enough, and she carried more than anyone ever knew. And in the middle of that exhaustion, God placed a small light in their hands. When their son, George Harvey Strait, Jr., Bubba, arrived in 1981, it was as if a window cracked open in a house that had long been dark. Norma held that baby with a steadiness born from years of carrying more than her share. And George, though tired and stretched thin, looked at his son as if seeing a second chance. He later said, "Bubba brought something back into the house we thought we'd lost." And in that simple sentence lived the hope and warmth they poured into raising that boy. Late-night feedings, tiny rodeo boots by the front door, George teaching him how to sit a saddle. In those moments, their home felt alive again, held together by the small heartbeat between them. But life has a way of striking hardest when the ground finally feels steady. And then came the blow. No parent is built to withstand the sudden loss of their daughter in a car accident. One moment, one phone call, a line drawn straight through their lives, before and after. The house that had once echoed with laughter turned unbearably quiet, as if even the walls understood something precious had been torn away. It was a kind of pain that hollowed the days and darkened the nights, a grief that lived in the breath between words. Yet the miracle, the impossible miracle, was the choice they made in that darkness. They did not drift apart. They turned toward each other, clinging to whatever strength they still had, refusing to let the tragedy swallow the last unbroken pieces of their family. Holding on when letting go would have been far easier. George would later confess in a moment of unguarded truth, "She saved me more times than she'll ever know." Inside that line lived every morning Norma steadied him when he could barely rise. Every night she kept their world from collapsing beneath the weight of grief. Her strength became the quiet backbone of their survival, the force that lifted them through a loss that could have shattered anyone else. Even as success swept him into arenas and stadiums, Norma's weight did not lighten. It shifted. Fame has a way of stealing a man from his own dinner table, and George was no exception. She became the quiet anchor behind the noise, the woman paying bills while tour buses idled miles away. The woman making holidays feel whole, even when George arrived home too tired to speak. The woman raising Bubba with steadiness and patience through seasons when George didn't fully understand the price she was paying. Their marriage weathered arguments, sharp words born of fatigue and distance, but also mornings where coffee steamed between their hands and silence felt gentle instead of heavy. They were imperfect, they were real, and that realness held, but life still had storms to hurl their way. As George grew older and touring carved pain into his spine, Norma carried a new fear, watching the man she loved push through. Hurt, he hid from the world, and in 2025, a different kind of turmoil struck. A lawsuit filed against their son Bubba and his wife Tamara. Over $12,462 in a home renovation dispute. Headlines spread faster than truth, casting shadows over a private family matter. George did not attack, explain, or deflect. He simply stood steady. As a father who believes a man must face his storms standing up, he lets his children stand on their own feet. A longtime friend said, "That's how he was raised, and that's how he raises." Through young love and empty pockets, through long distancing nights that nearly broke them. Through grief that could have shattered a lifetime. Through fame that tried to swallow them, and storms that kept returning long after they deserved rest. One truth never shifted. Norma remained the quiet force who steadied the man the world crowned a king. Their marriage wasn't perfect. It wasn't tidy. It wasn't storybook. It endured. And sometimes the greatest love story isn't the one without storms. It's the one where two people choose again and again to face every storm side by side, refusing to let go. It's brutal how life can appear completely harmless right up until the second it decides to break. On a quiet Texas night in 1986, that brutality struck the Strait family without warning. Jennifer Lynn Strait, only 13, the bright spark who stitched warmth into every corner of their home, stepped out for what should have been an ordinary evening with friends. Earlier that day, she had been full of excitement, promising, "Just a short ride, Mom, I'll be back soon." George called from another room, "Be careful, Jen," and she smiled. That innocent, reassuring smile every parent keeps in their heart forever. And none of them, not her mother watching from the doorway, not her father listening to her voice trail off, not even Jennifer herself, knew an unthinkable truth. That moment was their last. The last smile, the last footsteps, the last time her shadow crossed the hallway. They didn't know that when the front door clicked shut, it wasn't closing on an evening. It was closing on their life as a complete family. They didn't know she was walking toward a night she would never return from. They didn't know their daughter would never come home again. But somewhere along that familiar Texas road, everything shifted in a heartbeat. The car picked up more speed than a young driver could handle. A curve tightened. Control slipped. Tires scraped against asphalt in a desperate fight for grip. And then, in one merciless instant, fate delivered its blow. The crash was sudden, brutal in its finality. No flames, no chaos, just the cold, shattering silence of impact. The kind that ends a life before anyone inside has time to scream or pray. Jennifer didn't make it. She was gone before help could reach her. Her friends survived with injuries, shaken and terrified. Their lives split forever into before and after. And the young driver, devastated, trembling, barely able to speak, faced an investigation that reached a heartbreaking conclusion. It was a tragic accident born from inexperience and speed, not recklessness, not cruelty. No criminal charges were filed, but guilt, the kind that seeps into a soul and refuses to leave, followed him for years. It was a burden he would carry long after the rest of the world moved on. For George and Norma, the nightmare began not with sirens, but with a phone call. A call no parent is ever ready to hear. The phone rang once, sharp, urgent, slicing through the quiet of their home like a warning. George picked it up, expecting something ordinary. Maybe a neighbor, maybe a friend. Instead, a trembling voice delivered words that froze his blood in place. His breath stopped. His fingers tightened around the receiver until his knuckles blanched. Across the room, Norma saw the color drain from his face. Not slowly, but all at once, and her knees buckled before he even spoke. "George, what is it?" she whispered, though deep inside she already felt the truth clawing its way toward her. The drive to the hospital was a blur of shaking hands and headlights cutting through the dark. They couldn't speak as hope slipped further from their reach with every passing mile. And then at the end of a sterile hallway, a doctor stepped toward them. His eyes lowered, his voice unsteady. "I'm so sorry. Your daughter didn't survive. The world didn't spin. It didn't explode. It simply collapsed, folding inward until even breathing felt impossible." The days that followed barely existed. Jennifer's bedroom door stayed shut, not because they were denying reality, but because opening it meant acknowledging a world she no longer lived in. Her favorite book lay open on the nightstand, a jacket still draped over her chair, the faint scent of her shampoo clinging to the air like a memory trying desperately not to fade. Norma drifted through the house in silence, fingertips brushing over her daughter's things as though afraid they might disappear beneath her touch. Bubba moved quietly, softening every footstep, instinctively trying not to add even one more crack to his parents' breaking hearts. A funeral isn't supposed to feel like the end of the world, but theirs did. The morning of Jennifer's farewell arrived heavy, as if the sky itself refused to lift. The wind bit with a cold that felt personal, almost intentional, as though nature understood what had been taken from the Straits. Dozens gathered. Yet for George Van Norma, the world shrank to the size of one small casket. George stood trembling, clutching his Estson to his chest like a man holding his own breaking heart. Norma leaned into him, fingers trembling like fragile glass. Her breath thin, her eyes locked on the one place a mother should never have to stand. The pastor's words drifted into the air, gentle but distant, because the only sound that truly reached George was the soft, devastating thud of earth falling onto the casket. That sound, small, final, merciless, etched itself into him for decades. When the moment came to turn away, Norma paused, her hand resting on the casket one last time, whispering a promise only a mother can whisper. A final goodbye no parent should ever have to speak, and then came the cruelest paradox. The world kept moving. Deadlines didn't pause, contracts didn't wait. Stages insisted he return. Night after night, the world demanded the strong, steady George Strait. Only Norma saw the truth. The nights he sat backstage, head in his hands, breath trembling, terrified that his voice might crack under the weight of grief. "I didn't know if I'd ever sing again," he later confessed. Yet he stepped into the lights anyway, not because the pain had healed, but because singing was the only place where the sorrow didn't suffocate him. Healing didn't come in waves. It came in inches, slow, brutal, and uneven. They didn't rebuild by forgetting Jennifer. They rebuilt by carrying her forward in everything they did. Norma held the family together with a quiet, unshakable strength. The kind that doesn't need applause to be heroic. George learned to breathe again, one note at a time, letting music cradle the sorrow he couldn't put into words. Bubba grew up with a tenderness beyond his years, moving through the world with the understanding that loss can change the way a heart beats. And somewhere along that long, aching road, a truth settled into everyone who truly knew their story. Life is fragile, love is urgent, and no tomorrow is guaranteed. Jennifer's time on Earth was heartbreakingly short, but the love she left behind became woven into every chapter of their lives that followed. And though the world celebrates George Strait as the king of country, those who look deeper know this. His greatest strength was never the power in his voice, but the strength it took to rise again after losing the light that once made his home feel whole. Death did not strike George Strait gently or slowly. It came like a storm with no mercy, tearing through the people who built him before he even had the chance to rise from the last blow. Losing his daughter had already carved a wound too deep for language, but fate was not done. It came again and again and again, ripping out every route, every anchor, every familiar piece of home. In 2009, the first bolt fell. Buddy, the big brother who had shielded George when their mother walked away. who taught him how to shoulder ranch work without complaint, who lifted him onto horses long before his legs were strong enough to climb, who knew every bruise and silence of his childhood, collapsed without warning from a coronary condition no one knew had been quietly stalking him for years. 58. Too young, too unfinished, too needed. George was in a Nashville studio when the phone rang. One moment, guitars hummed softly around him, and the next he felt the world tilt as a trembling voice delivered the kind of news that steals breath and breaks bone from the inside. He pressed a hand against the wall, unable to speak, as if someone had reached into his chest and crushed the center of him. At the funeral, the Texas wind cut through the crowd like a blade, sharp and indifferent, carrying echoes of the ranch days they had shared. Buddy's voice teasing him, steadying him, telling him, "Don't forget where you came from, little brother." Now that voice belonged only to memory. As he stood over the casket, George felt a light go out, because losing Buddy was not just losing a sibling. It was losing the keeper of his earliest truths, the one witness to the parts of him. No stage, no audience, no world had ever seen. It felt like losing the compass to his own beginning, like watching a road disappear that only the two of them had ever walked. And in the ache that followed, George learned a brutal, unforgettable truth. Sometimes the people who shape us don't raise us with speeches or wisdom. They raise us simply by standing beside us long enough for us to grow. Buddy had been that presence, quiet, steady, unshakable. And now he lived only in memory, leaving George to face the road ahead without the brother who had always believed he would go far and who he now had to learn to live without. Before he could even catch his breath, the storm shifted again, faster, darker, and far more personal. Barely a year after losing Buddy in 2010, his mother Doris, the woman whose absence had shaped the permanent quiet of his childhood, began slipping away to a long, merciless illness that drained her strength in slow, unforgiving inches. What had once been a force that felt unreachable to a boy who needed her was now a frail figure lying beneath thin hospital blankets, fighting for breath one careful inhale at a time. George visited her as often as he could, sitting beside her bed in a silence that cut deeper than words. Sometimes she reached for his hand with a trembling gentleness that shattered him. A touch so light it felt like apology and goodbye woven into one. Other times, drifting in and out of clarity, she whispered remnants of old memories. The smell of horses after a Texas rain, the way little George used to tug at her dress when he was scared, the lullabies she sang before life pulled her away. Their past had been messy, splintered by absence, distance, and choices that carved wounds neither of them had fully healed. But in those final days, the sharpness softened. The walls between them thinned. Something fragile and unfinished began to mend. One afternoon, when the room was dim and her breaths were shorter than they should have been, George took her hand, the same hand he had once reached for as a child, and murmured barely above a whisper, "I forgive you, Mom." It wasn't a performance. It wasn't a dramatic gesture meant for the world. It was simply the truth. A son finally understanding the humanity of a woman he had spent years trying to understand. She squeezed his fingers, weak but certain. It was the closest they ever came to rewriting the past. When Doris finally passed, quiet, exhausted, fading like a candle that had burned far too long. George felt the grief strike from multiple angles at once. For the mother he lost, for the childhood he wished he'd had, for the love they only learned how to share when time was already running out. It was a strange, painful kind of mourning, grieving not only the woman who died, but the years that died with her, the conversations they never finished, the tenderness they found only at the edge of goodbye. And when he walked out of the hospital into the cold 2010 air, one truth settled deep inside him. Forgiveness doesn't erase the past, but it frees a man from carrying its weight forever. His mother's passing didn't give him closure. It gave him clarity. And in that clarity, George Strait finally allowed himself to love the woman he had spent so long trying to understand. And just as grief was beginning to take a shape he could bear, fate delivered its most merciless strike. In 2013, the final anchor of his world began to fade. His father, John Byron Strait Sr., the man who had held their fractured family together when their mother walked away. The man who taught George how to work without whining, hurt without breaking, and stand without leaning, entered a sudden, terrifying decline after years of quietly battling failing health. Overnight, strength became weakness. Certainty became fear. George spent countless nights in the hospital, lit only by the pale glow of monitors counting down the final beats of a life that had once carried two boys through every storm. Sometimes John woke long enough to squeeze his son's hand, a grip weaker than George remembered, but still steady in its meaning. Other times he drifted in and out of consciousness, slipping further from the world he had spent his life holding up. One storm-heavy evening, as rain tapped against the hospital window like a slow goodbye, George leaned close and whispered, "You did good, Dad. You carried us through everything." His father opened his eyes, tired, soft, proud, and for one suspended second, time bent, letting father and son meet in the place between memory and farewell. It was the last moment of clarity they would ever share. When John finally passed, the grief didn't howl. It crushed. George stepped into the hallway, bracing against the wall as if the building itself had shifted beneath him. Losing his daughter tore his heart. Losing Buddy shattered the map of his childhood. Losing his mother reopened wounds he thought he had buried. But losing his father, the last route, the final link to where he came from, was the moment the world itself changed shape. It was the moment a man who had stood unshaken before millions silently realized. Even kings become orphans. And in that collapse, a brutal clarity rose inside him. The kind only a man who has lost almost everything can understand. In the years that followed, the world saw George Strait illuminated by blinding arena lights, heard the steel in his voice, and watched him command crowds most artists only dream of. But they never saw the shadows that traveled with him onto every stage. They didn't see the quiet nights in anonymous hotel rooms where he would glance instinctively at the empty chair, the chair where his father once sat during rehearsals, offering a nod that meant more than any applause. They didn't see the way he paused backstage before stepping into the spotlight, letting the memory of Buddy, his mother, and his father settle into him like a weight he carried not to suffer, but to honor. Each loss carved him deeper, made him steadier, more painfully human. And somewhere in the long stretches of highway between airports and sound checks, in those lonely hours when the world slept and only grief stayed awake, a truth took root inside him, a truth heavy enough to reshape a man. Time is not a guarantee. It is a gift. The people who build us, raise us, forgive us, teach us, and believe in us. They are not permanent fixtures. They are moments, fragile, fleeting, irreplaceable. George came to understand that forgiveness delayed is forgiveness sometimes never given. That love unspoken is love that may never reach the ears it was meant for. That the soft, everyday miracles, a father's presence, a brother's laugh, a mother's touch, can vanish without warning, leaving only the regret of what we assumed we had more time to say. And yet, through every storm, he rose, not because he was unbreakable, but because he refused to let loss turn him cold. He carried his scars the way a soldier carries medals, not for pride, but as reminders of the people who shaped him. That beyond crowns, beyond records, beyond the mythology of the king of country is what makes George Strait extraordinary. A man who kept standing after fate, stripped away nearly everyone who once helped him stand, and who emerged with a gentler heart, urging the rest of us to hold our loved ones tighter while they're still within reach. It is one of life's cruelest tricks. After a man survives heartbreak that should have ended him, fate turns its next attack inward, letting his own body become the battlefield. And for George Strait, now in his late 50s and early 60s, the decade after losing so many of the people who shaped him brought a new kind of storm. It didn't arrive with spectacle. It crept in quietly, disguised as ordinary fatigue. A scratch in the throat after long shows, a tightness in his chest during rehearsals, a stiffness in his back that lingered longer with each passing year. At first, he waved it off. "Just tired," he told Norma with a weary smile, but she saw what he tried to hide, the way his fingers lingered at his throat after every performance. the subtle W cease when he reached for his boots. The nights he curled toward the edge of the bed because lying flat sent a bolt of lightning down his spine. After a lifetime of absorbing pain without complaint, George tried to soldier through it again. But this time, pain refused to be ignored. The first real blow came around 2011 when severe pharyngitis seized the very instrument that had carried him through decades of loss, triumph, and survival. During rehearsal, his notes cracked, then collapsed entirely, leaving only a rasp that terrified him in a way no tragedy ever had. The doctor's warning at age 59 hit him harder than any critic could. "If you push this, George, you may not get it back." The words rattled through him like shrapnel. Canceling shows felt like betrayal. Betrayal of the fans, the crew, the discipline his father had taught him. But worse was the fear he whispered only once to Norma late one night when the room was dark enough to reveal the truth. "What if this is how it ends?" Norma rested her hand over his heart, feeling the tremor beneath her palm. "Then we fight," she whispered. "We fight like we always have together." And he fought. Steam inhalers, vocal rest, canceled dates that broke his heart. When the voice finally returned, it was changed. Deeper, textured, marked by a fragility only he could hear. And yet that fragility made it more human, more lived in, more true. But nothing prepared him for the next storm. The one that struck at his back, his spine, his very ability to stand. By 2014, while nearing 70 years of horseback riding, arena stage pacing, long-haul travel, and bone-deep tension began carving merciless lines of pain down his body. It hit without warning. A stabbing jolt when he bent over, a sudden collapse of strength while tying a boot, a wave of burning numbness across his lower spine. Some mornings he couldn't straighten. Some nights Norma had to brace her shoulder beneath his arm, lifting him inch by inch from the mattress. Backstage, before shows, he gripped the countertop until his knuckles whitened, waiting for the electric pain to dull enough to walk into the spotlight. Doctors spoke of inflammation, nerve compression, the slow grind of age, words heavier than any stadium he'd ever filled. In 2018, 2021, 2023, and again in 2024 to 2025, several shows had to be postponed or canceled, something that cut deeper than any public knows. Bubba would slip into the room, steady his father's shoulders, whispering, "Dad, it's okay. You're allowed to rest. You've carried enough." But George, driven by a lifetime of discipline, pushed on. "I hate feeling weak," he told Norma once, voice cracking. She cupped his face and said, "This isn't weakness. This is what strength looks like, surviving pain you don't deserve." Through every setback, the burning throat, the screaming back, the stiffening joints, the nights he couldn't lift his guitar, George kept standing. And when he couldn't, those who loved him held him up. Norma became his quiet guardian, his healer in the shadows. She warmed towels for his throat at dawn. She massaged ointment into his back while he clenched his jaw against the pain. She sat behind him during the worst nights, her palm over his chest, counting his breaths to keep him steady. Sometimes she whispered memories to anchor him. "Remember how Jen used to jump on your shoulders before breakfast?" In those moments, the past didn't haunt him, it carried him. Bubba, now a grown man, took on his own role as protector, tightening his father's belt when George's hands shook too much before a show, checking on him after the crowd roared, asking, "Still with me, Dad?" And in the quiet moments of exhaustion, George would close his eyes and whisper, "They didn't give up on me, so I can't give up on myself." The voices of his father, his brother, his daughter, not ghosts but reasons, formed the backbone of his resilience. And slowly, stubbornly, he began to rise again. His body didn't return to the way it once was, but it found a new rhythm, a new equilibrium. He learned to rest without guilt. He learned that survival is not stoicism, but wisdom. He learned that age is not surrender. It is a badge earned by fighting every battle life throws at a man. His voice returned richer, shaped by time and truth. His back steadied enough for him to keep stepping beneath the bright lights. And in those years, in his 70s, in the decade after loss, aging, and pain, George Strait became more than the king of country. He became proof of a truth every older heart knows but rarely admits. Time bends us, pain humbles us, Illness tests us, but none of it defeats us if we keep choosing to rise. And if we let the people who love us help carry the weight. Strength is not the absence of hurt. Strength is the courage to keep standing and the grace to let others lift you when you can't. Now at 73, George Strait stands not just as a musical icon, but as one of the quietest, most extraordinary self-made success stories in American entertainment. His estimated net worth, now approaching $300 million, feels unreal when held against the memory of a young ranch kid who once counted loose change with Norma just to buy groceries. His wealth today rises from decades of platinum albums, record-breaking tours, catalog royalties, brand partnerships, real estate investments, and the disciplined financial choices of a man who has always played the long game. Yet the fortune is not the miracle. The miracle is the unlikely road that carried him from dusty rodeo grounds to a life of abundance he never dared imagine. Success didn't make him louder. It simply made him more grateful, aware that every blessing he holds now was once something he could only hope for. Nowhere is his ascent more visible than in the places he has called home. His real estate legacy spans across Texas like a map of every chapter he has lived. At its heart stands his once legendary 12.22-acre hilltop estate in San Antonio, a property so breathtaking it felt almost unreal. Sculptor-architect Bill Tull spent 3 years shaping it by hand. Adobe-inspired walls, carved wooden ceilings, stone courtyards that glowed at dusk, 14 fireplaces flickering like scattered stars, a private spa wing, an infinity pool spilling over the edge of Texas hills, and a cliffside patio where sunsets painted the sky in ember gold. It was less a home than a story. His story told in light, stone, and silence. Though he eventually sold the estate, it remains one of the most extraordinary celebrity residences Texas has ever seen. Today, George divides his time between ranch properties, a lake retreat, and discreet holdings across the state. These places are not monuments to wealth, but sanctuaries. Long fences stretching toward the horizon, grazing horses, creaking porch boards, oak shadows sliding across the grass. This is the kind of wealth that doesn't boast, it breathes. His assets extend far beyond land, forming a world built on craftsmanship and legacy. George has long loved machines with soul, classic Chevys restored to perfection, custom Western-tuned pickups, work trucks weathered by real dirt and real miles. His watch collection is equally curated, rugged Western chronographs, understated luxury pieces, and a few Swiss timepieces gifted during milestone tours. Yet the crown jewel of his private world is the sky itself. A licensed pilot for decades, Strait has owned and flown several aircraft, most notably the Gulfstream G450, a long-range jet capable of crossing continents with quiet ease. To outsiders, it looks like extravagance. To George, it is a lifeline, a way to finish a show and be home with Norma the same night, to keep fame from stealing the time that matters most. His planes, his trucks, his watches, none of them are trophies. They are mile markers, reminders of every road he survived to build the life he has now. His personal world today is anchored not by fame, but by steadiness. Bubba, now a father and accomplished songwriter and rodeo competitor, has become a guardian of the family's legacy. Family gatherings are simple and warm, children racing through hallways, fishing lines dropped into quiet lakes, the smell of grilled suppers drifting across wide porches. In recent years, George has spoken openly about his estate plans. He intends to leave behind not just financial security, but guidance, trust structures built to protect his children's futures and preserve the values he holds sacred: humility, responsibility, and devotion to family. His philanthropy remains enormous, yet intentionally understated. Through the Jennifer Strait Memorial Foundation, he has supported children's charities for decades, quietly donating millions to programs offering medical care, shelter, and hope. He continues to back military charities, disaster relief projects, and community efforts across Texas. For George Strait, generosity is not a performance. It is part of the man he became through hardship and faith. And in these later years, so gentle, so earned, George Strait has stepped into a chapter defined not by crowds, but by peace. He rides when his back allows, walks slowly when he must, prays softly, forgives freely, and holds Norma's hand the way he did when they were 19 kids with nothing but love and courage. His home is quiet now, filled with photographs, both displayed and tucked away. Faces he misses, faces he loves, pieces of a lifetime that shaped him into the man he is. His reflections carry the calm weight of someone who has seen the full circle of life, the rising, the breaking, the rebuilding, and the grace that waits on the other side. And if there is one truth that crowns his legacy, it is this: greatness is not measured by the noise a man makes, but by the light he leaves in the hearts of those who walk beside him. Thank you for traveling this journey with us. May your life be filled with peace, strength, love, and abundance. And on behalf of Golden American Stars, I wish you and everyone you hold dear a future of health, protection, deep family harmony, and a bond that stays strong for all the years ahead. May your home be warm, your relationship steady, and your days filled with every happiness your heart can carry.